Salt spray finds the cut on your knuckles before the sun finds the horizon, and it stings enough to wake you fully. Above you the black flag hangs limp against a mast still grey with night, and somewhere below the ship's boy is already turning the half-hour sandglass for the change of watch. You signed your mark to a folded paper 8 months ago, in a tavern that smelled of tar and rum, and in doing so you traded the king's law for a crew's own law. 1 vote per man, a fixed share of everything taken, and a captain who can be voted out the moment he stops earning his place. It is 1717, the high tide of piracy in the Caribbean, and for the length of this one day you will live the whole of it, the drudgery and the plunder, the storm and the tribunal, and the noose, waiting somewhere over the horizon for men exactly like you. You wake the way you always wake now, all at once, both eyes open before your mind catches up, because a hammock teaches a man to trust nothing about the dark around him. The kestrel groans through a swell somewhere under your spine, timber answering water the way it has every night for the 4 months you have called her home. 40 other hammocks hang shoulder to shoulder in the space below the gun deck, close enough that your neighbour's breath is warm on the back of your neck, close enough that when the ship rolls hard you all roll together, a single slow tide of bodies. Something small runs across the boards near your ear and you do not flinch anymore. Rats came aboard with the flour and never left, and the men have made a kind of peace with them, the way you make peace with everything you cannot fix at sea. 8 months ago you were a foretopman on a merchant brig out of Bristol, hauling sugar and hides for wages that came late or not at all, and a black flag rose out of the morning haze off the windward passage, and your captain struck his colours without firing a shot. You remember standing on your own deck watching 30 armed men come over the rail laughing, and you remember the offer that followed. Join or be put ashore with your sea chest and no hard feelings. You made your mark on their paper before the sun was fully up. It was not entirely the money, though the money mattered. It was the vote. Aboard the brig you had never once been asked your opinion of anything. Aboard the Kestrel, before you had scrubbed the tar from your hands, you were asked to vote on whether to chase a second sail spotted to the south. You have thought about that morning more than you expected to. A bell sounds twice above you, muffled through 2 decks of oak, the last stroke of the middle watch. Around you other men are already stirring, not because the bell demands it of them specifically, only because 4 months of the same rhythm has worn a groove into every body aboard, and the groove says it is nearly time. You swing your legs down into standing water an inch deep that never quite drains from the bilge, no matter how often the pumps run, and you feel for your boots with your toes in the dark, out of habit more than need. Somewhere forward a man coughs the deep wet cough that has been getting worse since the last storm, and nobody remarks on it, because there is nothing anybody aboard can do about a man's lungs except give him a lighter watch, which the crew already voted to do. That, too, is new to you. Aboard the brig a sick man was a sick man, and the captain's business alone. Here the sickness of one man was a matter the whole crew put to a show of hands. You find your jacket, salt-stiffened and smelling of tar and old sweat, and you climb the companionway ladder toward a square of sky just beginning to lose its blackness, the first grey bruise of morning pressing in from the east. The air that meets you at the top is cold and clean in a way the air below never is, and for a moment before the day's work finds you, it is almost enough to make the whole arrangement feel like it was worth the price everyone aboard knows they will eventually pay for it. On deck the sky is the colour of a fresh bruise, purple sliding into a thin band of orange low over the water, and the ship's boy, a lanky Bermudian named for nobody remembers what reason, simply the glass, is turning the half-hour sandglass mounted by the binnacle and striking the bell to mark it. He has done this every 30 minutes of every watch since before you came aboard, and he will do it again in 30 more, small ceaseless clockwork. Nobody else aboard has patience or steadiness enough to keep. The man coming off watch, a broad Welshman called Rees who has sailed since he was 10 years old, nods to you without a word and heads for the ladder, already half asleep on his feet. You take his place at the leeward rail and let your eyes adjust to the growing light on open water. No land visible in any direction, only the long slow roll of the Atlantic swell working its way into the Caribbean basin. Somewhere aft near the wheel, the quartermaster stands with his hands folded behind his back, watching the horizon the same as you, though his authority over this ship in this moment outweighs the captain's by a wide margin. It surprises most new men to learn this, and it surprised you. The captain of the Kestrel commands absolutely the instant a chase begins or a fight starts, when split-second orders need one voice and no debate, but the rest of the time, the food, the discipline, the division of plunder, the settling of quarrels between men, all of it belongs to the quartermaster, a man the crew elected themselves, and can vote out the moment they lose confidence in him. Historians who have studied the surviving articles of ships like this one describe it as a rough practical balance of powers, built by men who had all served under captains with unchecked authority and wanted, this one time, something different. The current quartermaster is a lean, quiet man named Corbin, who was a cooper before he was a pirate and still counts everything, barrels, days, shares, coins, with the same careful attention he once gave to hoops and staves. He catches your eye across the deck and gives the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between men who trust each other's competence without needing to say so. The sun clears the horizon fully now, throwing long gold light down the length of the deck and across the coiled rigging, and for a few minutes the ship is almost beautiful, indifferent to everything that will be asked of her before this day ends. You watch a flying fish break the surface 50 yards off the bow and skim the water in a long silver arc before vanishing again, and somewhere behind you the cook is already banging a pot against the galley stove, which means breakfast, thin as it will be, is not far off. The glass turns his sandglass again without being told, and the small grains begin their slow fall through the narrow waist, measuring out the next half hour of a day that has, in every sense that matters to the 80 men aboard this ship, only just begun. Before breakfast comes the holystone, a flat block of soft grey sandstone the size of a family Bible that you drag back and forth across the deck, planking on your knees, seawater sloshing under it, sand grinding into every seam. Every man not on watch does this together, a long ragged line of bent backs moving in loose unison from bow to stern, and the work is miserable and necessary in equal measure. A wooden deck left unscored grows slick with mildew, and worse within a week in this heat, and a slick deck kills men in a fight faster than any cutlass. Nobody aboard needs this explained to them twice. You work your section without complaint, because complaint changes nothing about the work, and because Corbin walks the line as it goes, not to hurry anyone, only to make sure the injured are given lighter patches of deck, and the healthy take the harder ground near the scuppers where the salt crust builds thickest. A man named Osei, taken off a Portuguese slave ship 11 months ago and voted full membership within a week, of proving himself in a boarding action, works the section beside you and hums something low and rhythmic that none of the English speakers aboard recognise, and nobody asks him to stop. The ship carries men from a dozen different origins, English and Welsh and Irish, a Dutchman, 2 Frenchmen, several Africans who chose the crew's articles over the alternative that had brought them across the ocean in chains, and out here on this deck, at this task, the differences that would matter enormously. On land matter a great exactly. Historians are careful about that word. But it is a rough levelling that few of these men experience like anywhere else in their lives. When the holystoning finishes, the ship's carpenter, a taciturn Scot named Fergus, who is worth more to this crew than any 3 fighting men, goes below with a lantern to check the hull seams and the pumps, work he does every morning without being asked, because a wooden ship far from any yard lives or dies by how well one man understands her joints. He comes up an hour later with tar under his nails and reports to Corbin quietly, and whatever he says makes the quartermaster's mouth tighten slightly, though he says nothing to the rest of the crew yet. You notice this the way you notice everything now. Small signals passed between the men who actually run this ship, because your life depends on reading them correctly. A quarrel breaks out near the foremast between 2 hands over a borrowed knife, voices rising fast the way they do among tired men on an empty stomach, and Corbin is there within seconds, not shouting, simply present, and the argument dies almost as fast as it started. The articles every man aboard signed forbid open fighting between crew members, except by a formalised duel ashore, witnessed and fair, precisely because a knife fight below decks in close quarters can cripple a ship's fighting strength faster than any enemy can. You have seen the duel rule invoked exactly once, and it ended, as most do, with both men too embarrassed by the ceremony of it to actually draw blood. Breakfast is still a few minutes off, so you find yourself, as you often do in this stretch of morning, near the scarred mess table, bolted amidships, where the ship's articles are kept folded inside an oilskin pouch against the damp. Corbin brings the paper out perhaps once a week, not because anyone has forgotten its terms, but because a new man occasionally needs to sign it, and today there is one. A Spaniard pulled off yesterday's chase who chose, as most captured sailors do, to join rather than be set ashore with nothing. The paper itself is unremarkable to look at, water-stained and much folded, but every man aboard treats it the way other men treat scripture. It sets out, in plain terms any sailor can follow, how a man earns his place. Full votes on where the ship sails and whether to fight, equal shares of plunder with only small extra portions to the captain and quartermaster for the added risk of their positions, and a fixed schedule of compensation for injury that would strike any Royal Navy sailor as astonishing. The loss of a right arm is worth so many pieces of 8, a left arm somewhat less, an eye or a finger a smaller sum again, paid out of the ship's common fund before any other division of the plunder takes place. Historians who have studied documents like this one, most drawn from an early printed history of piracy, whose author's true identity is still debated, note that this compensation scheme predates any formal disability provision offered by most European navies of the period by a full generation. Whether every ship at sea honoured its own articles as faithfully as the Kestrel's crew claims to, is not something any historian can verify with certainty, but the paper itself, and the fact that men were willing to sign it with their own hand rather than merely obey it, tells you something true about what these men wanted from this life that the usual stories about pirates rarely mention. The Spaniard signs with an X beside his new name, a common enough mark among men who never learned their letters, and 2 others witness it, and Corbin folds the paper carefully back into its oilskin as though he were folding something considerably more valuable than a single sheet of much-mended paper. The articles forbid gambling for money aboard ship, on the theory that a crew in debt to one another is a crew that will eventually turn on itself. Though dice for small stakes happen anyway in corners, the quartermaster chooses not to see too closely. They forbid bringing women aboard disguised as men, on pain of death, a rule the crew takes with total seriousness, despite the fact that no one aboard the Kestrel has ever actually tested it. They forbid deserting a post or striking a fellow crewman, and they set the terms under which a man may leave the crew entirely, which happens more often than most people imagine, sailors simply choosing at some port to walk away from the life with whatever share they are owed. You watch the newly signed Spaniard shake hands with 3 men in a row, already in the space of a single morning, more thoroughly welcomed into this crew than he likely ever was aboard the ship that had owned him yesterday, and you think, not for the first time, that whatever else this life costs a man, it does not cost him his say in how he is governed. Breakfast, when it finally comes, is salt pork boiled soft enough to chew, and a biscuit hard enough that you tap it twice against the table edge first, out of long habit, to knock loose whatever weevils have made a home in the flour. Nobody remarks on the weevils. A man who refused to eat biscuit with weevils in it aboard any ship in this ocean would starve inside a week, and every sailor learns young to pick them out by feel in the dark or simply eat around the fact of them. What strikes you still, 4 months in, is that the captain eats the same boiled pork and the same tapped biscuit as everyone else, sitting at the same long table rather than some separate cabin with a servant to bring him better fare. Aboard the Bristol brig the captain dined alone on fowl and wine, while the crew made do with whatever the ship's stores allowed, and nobody thought to question the arrangement because that was simply how a ship worked. Here it is not how a ship works, and the difference still catches you off guard some mornings, the plain fact of a man who could claim privilege choosing instead to eat what you eat. There is a small ration of watered rum passed around, a mixture the sailors call grog after the coat of a British admiral, who first ordered the water added to a full rum ration to slow the drunkenness of his crews, and the men drink it quickly and without ceremony. More medicine than pleasure at this hour. Talk around the table runs to yesterday's weather, a rumour that a Royal Navy sloop has been seen working the passage 2 days south, and a long good-natured argument between 2 Irishmen about whose home county brews the better whisky, an argument you gather has been running for months without any hope of resolution. O.C. sits near you again, eating quickly and efficiently, and when a younger hand makes a clumsy joke that edges close to unkind about his accent, 3 other men shut it down before you can even decide whether to say something yourself. Not out of any grand principle so much as simple crew discipline, a man who fought well in the last boarding earns his place at this table as surely as anyone else, and disrespecting that earns you Corbin's attention fast. You finish your biscuit and pork in a few minutes, the way everyone does, because meals aboard are functional rather than social in any leisurely sense, fuel taken on quickly before the day's demands resume. Fergus the carpenter eats standing, still turning over whatever he found below decks this morning, and you notice Corbin watching him with the same tight attention from earlier. Something is on the quartermaster's mind that has not yet been shared with the crew, and you have learned enough in 4 months to know that whatever it is will surface in its own time, not before. The cry comes down from the masthead a little before the sun has fully cleared the morning haze. One word repeated twice, sail, sail, and every head on deck turns as one toward the lookout, a wiry young Frenchman named Pascal who has the sharpest eyes aboard and knows it. He calls bearing and rough distance, and within a minute Corbin has his glass out, bracing against the shrouds, studying the pale smudge on the horizon that means nothing yet to your naked eye, but clearly means a great deal to his trained one. The ship, he reports to the deck at large, looks to be a merchant brig, likely riding low with cargo rather than running light and empty, and probably making for one of the trade routes that thread between the islands toward a Spanish or English port. This is the moment aboard the Kestrel that differs most sharply from anything you knew before you signed the articles. Aboard a naval vessel, the captain alone would decide whether to give chase, and no man below him would be asked his opinion. Here the captain, a broad quiet Cornishman, everyone calls simply the skipper, though his given name is known to the crew, steps forward and puts the matter plainly to the deck. A chase means hours of hard sailing, and the risk, however small, of finding armed resistance or a naval escort waiting unseen. A successful prize means shares for every man aboard, possibly enough to set several of them up comfortably ashore for the first time in their lives. A show of hands settles it in under a minute, and the vote runs overwhelmingly toward the chase, which surprises nobody, since men do not typically sign on to a pirate crew to vote for caution. You raise your own hand along with the rest, feeling the small strange thrill of a decision that is, in some real fraction, yours. The order goes out to trim sail and come about onto an intercept course, and the whole ship seems to wake at once, men moving to lines and braces with the particular fast efficiency of a crew that has done this many times before and knows exactly what is expected of them. Fergus disappears below again, this time to check that the 4 small cannon the Kestrel carries are properly secured and ready, since a chase that turns into a fight is always possible even if unlikely. The mood on deck lifts noticeably, tired men from an early morning of holystoning, suddenly moving with purpose and something close to excitement, the specific charged energy of 80 men all pulling toward the same uncertain outcome. You catch Osius' eye across the deck and he grins, the first wide unguarded smile you have seen from him, and you find yourself grinning back, despite everything you know about how these mornings sometimes end for men on the other end of a chase like this one. As the gap closes and the merchant brig's hull grows from a smudge into a recognizable shape, sails full and unaware, or perhaps only now beginning to suspect what is bearing down on her, the order comes to run up the colours. The flag that goes up the Kestrel's mizzen-mast is a plain field of black tarred cloth bearing a crude painted skull above 2 crossed cutlasses, sewn by the ship's own sailmaker from an old topsail, and it snaps out flat in the wind the moment it clears the shrouds, visible now for miles in every direction. You have heard men who have never sailed describe this flag as pure theatre, and in a sense they are right, though they miss what the theatre accomplishes. A merchant crew that sees that flag and understands what it means faces an immediate, brutal arithmetic: resist and risk the boarding party's violence and the loss of the ship entirely, or strike your colours now and very likely walk away with your life, your possessions, and sometimes even your ship once its cargo has been taken. The overwhelming majority of captains facing that flag choose the second option, and the Kestrel's own quartermaster prefers it just as strongly, since a fight costs the crew time, ammunition, and very possibly wounded or dead men for a prize that will very likely surrender without any of that cost. You watch through the press of men at the rail as, sure enough, within minutes of the flag clearing the mast, the brig's own colours begin to slide down her halyard, a small pale gesture of surrender visible even at this distance, and a ragged cheer goes up along the Kestrel's deck, more relief than triumph in the sound of it. The skipper gives the order to close the remaining distance under easy sail rather than a hard pursuit now, no reason to press the ship, or her crew any harder than necessary once the outcome is already settled. Corbin moves along the deck, assigning the boarding party, choosing men for calm temperament as much as fighting skill, since the goal of the next hour is an orderly search and transfer of cargo, not a battle. You are named among those staying aboard the Kestrel to manage the sails and keep both vessels under control during the transfer, a task you find yourself faintly disappointed by, though you recognize the feeling as foolish. Somewhere behind you a man begins coiling a length of boarding line with the unhurried competence of someone who has done this exact task dozens of times before, and the black flag continues to snap overhead in the freshening wind, doing, in this moment, exactly the work it was sewn to do without a single blade needing to be drawn. The final approach, even with the brig's colours already struck, is not without its own held-breath tension, because a surrender signalled from a distance is not the same as a surrender confirmed, and more than one crew in these waters has told stories of a false strike followed by a sudden run for open water, or a hidden gun crew waiting behind closed ports. The Kestrel herself is built for exactly this moment, a single-masted sloop with a shallow draft that lets her work close to shore and outrun almost anything larger than herself on open water, chosen by her original owners for speed, and chosen again by the men who took her from those owners for precisely the same reason. You feel the difference in how she handles compared to the lumbering Bristol brig you served on before. Quick to answer the helm, quick to heal and recover, alive under your feet in a way that heavier ships never quite manage. As the distance closes to within a few hundred yards, the skipper calls for the sloop to come up alongside rather than crossing the brig's bow, a manoeuvre that keeps the Kestrel's small battery of cannon bearing the whole time without ever fully committing to a pass that could be answered. Fergus stands ready by the nearest gun with a slow match, though everyone aboard, including Fergus, expects it will not be needed. On the brig's deck you can now make out individual figures, a knot of sailors standing well clear of the rail with their hands visibly empty, and a single man, likely the captain, standing slightly forward of the rest in what you recognise as the particular stillness of a man trying very hard to look calm. The two ships draw within hailing distance, and the skipper calls across the closing water, his voice pitched to carry, identifying the Kestrel and demanding the brig heave to and prepare to be boarded, language that by now has the worn, practised cadence of a phrase spoken so many times it has become almost ceremonial. The brig's captain calls back his compliance, and you watch her crew begin to shorten sail without needing to be told twice, the particular fast obedience of men who have decided, correctly, that their best chance of walking away from this morning intact lies in cooperation rather than resistance. Grappling hooks go out from the Kestrel's deck, biting into the brig's rail, and the two hulls are drawn slowly together across the last stretch of water, timbers groaning as they finally touch, the whole encounter, from first sighting to this moment, having taken the better part of 2 hours, without a single weapon having been fired by either side. You watch from the Kestrel's rail as Corbin leads the boarding party across a plank laid between the two hulls, calm and methodical, no drawn blades among them beyond what a man wears at his belt as a matter of course. The brig's crew stands clustered near her mainmast exactly where they were told to wait, and Corbin's first words to them, once he is aboard, are not threats but questions. How many hands, what cargo, any injured men needing attention? This is, you have come to understand, entirely typical, and entirely at odds with the stories told about men like you back in whatever port these sailors call home. A search party moves below to inventory the hold, and word comes back within the half hour that the brig carries barrels of sugar, a quantity of dyewood, and a modest strongbox of coin intended for a merchant house in Charleston. It is a solid prize, not a spectacular one, the sort of ordinary cargo that makes up the great bulk of what pirate crews actually took in this period, far more often than the legendary chests of Spanish gold that later stories would fix in people's imaginations. Corbin gathers the brig's crew and makes the same offer that was made to you 8 months ago, and to the Spaniard just this morning. Any man who wishes to join the Kestrel's crew may sign her articles and take his equal share of everything from this day forward. Any man who does not wishes may be set ashore at the next island with his personal effects and no harm done. 2 of the brig's younger hands step forward almost immediately, their reasons likely no different from your own, poor pay and worse treatment aboard whatever vessel they had been serving, and they are welcomed aboard with the same rough handshakes the Spaniard received earlier. The brig's captain, for his part, asks only that his ship and the rest of his crew be allowed to continue on their way once the cargo has been transferred, and Corbin agrees without hesitation, since a ship left seaworthy and a crew left unharmed generates far less determined pursuit than a ship burned or a crew abused, a calculation every experienced quartermaster in these waters understands well. The transfer of cargo takes the better part of the afternoon. Barrels and boxes passed hand to hand across the plank in a long unbroken chain of men, sweating hard now under a climbing sun, the specific unglamorous labour that makes up the vast majority of what a successful prize actually looks like up close. By the time the last barrel comes across and the grappling hooks are cast off, the brig's crew stands at her rail watching the kestrel draw away, and more than one of them lifts a hand in something that looks less like fear, and more, oddly, like relief that the morning ended exactly as it did. By late afternoon the plunder sits stacked on the scarred mess table amidships, the same table where the Spaniard signed his mark this morning, sugar barrels lashed on deck nearby, and the small strong box of coins sitting open under Corbin's careful hands. The counting itself is slow, exact work, and Corbin does it the way he once counted barrel staves, laying coins into small piles with the unhurried precision of a man who knows that any error here will be noticed and remembered by 80 men who each have a direct stake in the outcome. The dyewood and sugar will be sold at the next friendly port, likely one of the small settlements along the coast where local merchants ask no awkward questions about where a cargo originated, and the proceeds added to the coin already counted before the full division is made. For now, Corbin announces the count aloud to the assembled crew, a running tally of what the coin alone amounts to, and a rough murmur of approval moves through the men at the number. Under the articles, every man aboard, from the newest signed hand to the skipper himself, receives one equal share of the total, with the skipper and Corbin each receiving a modest extra half share in recognition of the added burden and risk of their positions, a far cry from the outsized cut a merchant captain or naval officer would claim for himself under any other flag. Before any of that division happens, though, the injury fund is set aside first, untouched, a fixed sum held against the fixed compensation the articles promise for the loss of an eye, a hand, an arm, a leg, paid to any man so wounded before the rest of the crew ever sees their own portion. It strikes you every time you watch this happen, how seriously the crew treats this particular ritual, more seriously in some ways than the division of the shares that follows it, because every man aboard understands that the next unlucky cannon shot or fall from the rigging could make that fund the only thing standing between himself and a life as a beggar in some port with no hand left to work. A young hand named Tomlin, who lost 2 fingers to a jammed block during a storm 3 weeks back, is called forward now and paid his compensation from the fund in full view of the whole crew, counted out onto the table by Corbin's own hand, and the men around you nod with a kind of grim satisfaction at seeing the system work exactly as promised. Only after this is the remaining sum divided into equal piles, one per man, and passed out by name, each sailor stepping up to the table in turn to receive his share and tuck it away into whatever pouch or sea chest he trusts most. When your own name is called, you step forward and take your portion, more coin than you would have earned in half a year on the Bristol brig, and you feel the particular strange weight of money that was, in every practical sense, decided by your own vote this morning, rather than handed down from above by a man who never once asked what you thought. You notice the change before anyone says a word about it. The particular way the light thins and yellows across the water in the middle of the afternoon, and the long slow swell that has carried the kestrel gently all day, beginning to arrive from a slightly different quarter, a small disagreement between wind and sea that experienced hands read as clearly as a written warning. Fergus is the first to say it aloud, glancing up from whatever repair he has been making to the transferred sugar barrels and squinting at a thin ring of haze that has formed around the climbing sun, a halo old sailors in these waters have learned to distrust. The skipper checks his own barometer, a brass instrument he keeps in a small case near the wheel, and consults more often than he lets on, and whatever the mercury shows him is enough to change the set of his shoulders. This is the moment when the crew's rough democracy quietly steps aside without any vote being called for it, because the articles themselves grant the captain full and immediate authority over the handling of the ship in exactly this kind of circumstance, a provision every man aboard, however fond he is of his vote, is glad exists when the sea itself starts to look uncertain. Orders come fast now. Strike the topsail, double lash anything loose on deck, send the newly acquired sugar barrels below, and secure them properly rather than trusting the deck lashings that were good enough for calm water. You find yourself moving without needing to think much about the individual steps. Muscle memory built over months of drills the skipper has run precisely so that this moment, when it comes, does not require anyone to think too hard. Osi works beside you, securing a line of barrels, glancing up periodically at the darkening horizon to the southeast where a long grey wall of cloud has begun climbing visibly even as you watch it, faster than clouds have any right to climb on an ordinary afternoon. Pascal comes down from the masthead rather than staying aloft, a decision nobody questions, since a lookout perched 40 feet above a rolling deck is the last man anybody wants exposed once real wind arrives. The temperature of the air itself seems to shift, a faint metallic edge to it that you have felt only twice before in your life at sea, both times preceding weather bad enough to leave men talking about it for months afterward. Corbin moves along the deck, checking each lashing personally, no longer the quiet counter of coins from an hour ago, but something harder and more urgent. Because whatever authority the articles grant the skipper in weather like this, it is still Corbin's job to make sure every man aboard survives to divide another prize. By the time the last barrel is secured and the deck cleared of anything that could become a projectile in a hard roll, the grey wall to the southeast has swallowed half the visible sky, and the wind that reaches you now carries the first cold, damp edge of what is coming. The wind arrives before the rain does, a sudden hard shove against the kestrel's remaining sail that heels her sharply and sends every loose thing that was missed in the securing sliding across the deck at once. You grab a line and brace yourself against the pitch of the deck, salt spray already stinging your face, though the rain proper has not yet begun, and above you the last reefed sail cracks like a gunshot in the rising gusts. The skipper is at the wheel himself now, both hands locked on the spokes, calling orders in a voice pitched to cut through wind that is trying its hardest to swallow every word before it reaches you. The rain comes next in a solid grey wall that reduces visibility to almost nothing, and within minutes you are as thoroughly soaked as if you had gone over the side, the deck underfoot slick and treacherous, despite the morning's careful holystoning, every handhold now a matter of real survival rather than routine. A wave breaks over the bow and runs the length of the deck in a wall of green water that knocks 2 men off their feet, and very nearly takes a third over the rail entirely, saved only by a lifeline he had the sense to clip on before the worst of it arrived. You work the pumps in shifts now with 4 other men, the bilge filling faster than it has all voyage, and the rhythm of the work, push, pull, becomes the only thing in the world small enough to hold your attention against the much larger fact of the storm itself. Somewhere above the noise you hear Fergus shouting something about the mainmast's rigging, a strange shroud that needs immediate attention or risks the whole mast, and 2 men go forward into the worst of the wind and spray to see to it, work that on a calm day would be routine, and today amounts to something close to genuine heroism. The kestrel rides low and hard through swells that seem, in the grey half-light, considerably larger than any you have faced before, her shallow draught that serves her so well in a chase, now working against her stability in the deep troughs between waves. You think, in the strange, detached way a mind sometimes works under real strain, of the article's careful list of compensation for lost limbs, and how none of it says anything at all about a man simply washed over the side and never seen again, because there is no compensation the crew has ever devised for that particular outcome. The storm holds its worst intensity for perhaps 2 hours, though time itself becomes difficult to measure accurately inside it, and when it finally begins to ease, the wind dropping first and the rain trailing off some while after, the entire crew is left standing or slumped across a deck that looks like it has been picked up and shaken by some enormous hand. Nobody has gone over the side. Nobody, checking each other's faces in the returning light, appears seriously hurt, beyond bruises and rope burns, and a ragged, exhausted round of relief moves through the men at the Discovery, quieter than the cheer that met the brig's surrender this morning, but in its own way considerably more heartfelt. With the storm past and the kestrel's hull having taken a beating against seas rougher than any she has faced this voyage, the skipper makes the call that Fergus has been quietly urging for days. It is time to careen her, to run the ship up onto a sheltered stretch of sandy beach along a small uninhabited quay, known to the crew from earlier voyages, and scrape clean the barnacles and weed that have been slowing her steadily for weeks. This is not work any pirate crew undertakes lightly, because a ship deliberately beached and heeled over on her side, her guns unable to bear, half her crew ashore hauling on lines while the other half works the exposed hull with scrapers, is about as vulnerable as a vessel can be, a fact every experienced sea captain in these waters understands as well as any pirate does. Lookouts go up onto the quay's low ridge the moment the anchor is set, watching the horizon in every direction for any sign of a sail, naval or otherwise, that might catch the Kestrel in this exact posture of weakness. The tide is used to run the sloop up onto the sand at its highest point, and then, as the water recedes, block and tackle rigged to sturdy trees ashore hauls her over onto one side, exposing the long curve of her hull below the waterline, dark with weed and studded thick with barnacles that have grown since her last careening months ago. You are among the crew set to the actual scraping, wading in the shallows with a wide flat iron scraper, working the growth free in long satisfying strips that peel away to reveal clean planking beneath, tarred black and smooth. It is hot, exhausting, unglamorous work, the sun beating down directly now that the storm has cleared entirely, and you understand, doing it exactly why speed matters so much to a crew like this one. A hull left foul would cost the Kestrel the very advantage that let her outrun larger, better-armed vessels and slower ones, the whole practical logic of piracy in a small fast ship resting, in the end, on unglamorous hours like these. Fergus moves along the exposed hull, checking every seam personally, tapping planks and testing caulking, with the same careful attention he gives everything, and finds, near the bow, a section of timber softened by rot that will need patching before the ship is trustworthy again in open water. Word of this travels through the crew quickly, and though nobody says it aloud, you can feel the shared understanding that this stop will run longer than anyone hoped. Every extra hour spent here an hour the ship spends unable to flee or fight properly. A shout from the ridge lookout an hour before dusk sends a fast current of alarm through the whole camp. A sail reported to the north, and for several tense minutes the entire crew stands frozen between the half-finished hull and their weapons stacked well back from the water, before a second look confirms the distant ship is a fishing vessel of no threat at all, holding no interest in a small cay far from any trade route. The relief that follows is immediate and physical, several men laughing too loudly at nothing in particular, and the work resumes with renewed urgency to finish before full dark makes the whole exposed operation considerably more dangerous than it already is. It is Corbin who calls the crew together on the sand, once the hull work is finished, and the Kestrel floated off on the returning tide, and the particular flatness in his voice tells everyone at once that this is not an ordinary gathering. A young hand named Prosser, one of the men taken aboard from a prize several weeks before your own time on this ship, has been caught concealing a portion of coin from the strongbox division that took place before your capture of this morning's brig, coin that by rights belonged to the whole crew in equal shares, and that Prosser instead hid inside a false seam of his own sea chest. The articles are explicit and unambiguous on this point, a rule every man aboard understands without needing it explained twice. Theft from the common stock is among the few offences the articles treat as serious enough to threaten a man's whole place among the crew, because a man who steals from his own shipmates undermines the entire fragile arrangement that lets 80 very different men trust one another with their lives on a daily basis. Corbin lays the evidence before the assembled crew, plainly and without embellishment, the discovered coin itself, the testimony of the man who found it, and Prosser's own halting admission once confronted, and then, following the article's own procedure, puts the matter to a vote rather than deciding it alone. This is perhaps the starkest example you have yet witnessed of what this crew's rough justice actually looks like in practice. Not a captain's arbitrary word, but 80 men weighing evidence and casting a decision together, the same mechanism that decided this morning's chase now deciding a man's fate. The options on the table, as the articles set them out, run from a reduced share and public disgrace on the lighter end to marooning on the harsher end, an old and much feared punishment that leaves a man alone on some small deserted spit of sand or reef with only a pistol, a small quantity of powder and shot, and a flask of water, left to whatever fate follows from there. The debate runs longer and more heated than the morning's chase vote did, several men speaking on Prosser's behalf, noting his youth and the fact that this is his first offence, others arguing that leniency here only invites the next man to try the same thing with less honest witnesses to catch him. In the end, the crew settles on the lighter punishment a forfeiture of Prosser's full share from both this morning's prize and the last one before it, along with a formal public accounting of his offence entered by Corbyn's own hand into the ship's own record, so that any future crew he sails with will know what he did here. Prosser stands through the whole proceeding pale and silent, and when the vote is announced he says nothing beyond a single mumbled acknowledgement, and the crew, having settled the matter, moves on with a speed that surprises you slightly. No lingering resentment paraded, no further punishment beyond what was voted. The whole business closed and folded away the same as the articles themselves are folded back into their oilskin pouch until the next time they are needed. By the time the Kestrel stands off the quay again in open water, hull clean and Fergus patch holding well against a testing swell, the light has gone the deep gold of late afternoon sliding toward evening, and a mood settles over the deck that you have come to recognise as the particular relief of a hard day, finally, genuinely, ending. Someone produces a fiddle from below, a battered instrument that has survived at least 2 previous ships by the look of its many repairs, and a Frenchman named Belloc, not Pascal the Lookout but another man of the same nation entirely, begins working through a tune that starts slow and mournful, and gradually quickens into something several of the crew immediately recognise and begin clapping time to. A space clears near the mainmast without anyone officially calling for it, and 2 of the younger hands begin a rough, laughing approximation of a dance neither of them clearly learned properly, to the considerable amusement of everyone watching. The black flag has been struck for the evening, folded and stowed the same, as it is every night the ship is not actively engaged in a chase, and in its place only the ordinary business of a ship at rest continues. Watches assigned for the coming night, the day's damage and losses quietly tallied by those responsible for such things. You find a spot near the rail with a share of the evening's grog and watch the whole loose, unruly, oddly tender scene unfold in front of you. 80 men who this morning voted on a chase, who this afternoon buried their fear inside a storm, and their exhaustion inside a beach full of barnacles, now simply enjoying, without much self-consciousness, the fact of being alive at the end of a day that had several genuine chances to end otherwise. O.C. sits nearby, not dancing, watching with the same quiet contentment you feel yourself, and when you catch his eye, he raises his cup slightly in a small silent toast that needs no translation between you. Tomlin, still missing his 2 fingers from 3 weeks back, claps time on the rail with his good hand, and does not seem, tonight at least, especially troubled by what the sea has already taken from him. Prosser sits somewhat apart from the others, still absorbing the day's judgment, though even he is offered a cup by a man passing near him, a small, almost absent gesture of continued belonging that tells you more about how this crew actually functions than the formal proceedings on the beach did. The stars begin to come out properly as full dark settles, more of them visible out here than you ever saw, over Bristol's rooftops, and the fiddle eventually slows again into something quieter, and men begin drifting off in 2s and 3s toward whatever rest the coming night watch schedule allows them, the day's noise gradually giving way to the ordinary creak and murmur of a ship settling for the night. You draw the middle watch again tonight, the same stretch of hours that ended this whole long day when it began, and standing at the rail under a sky thick with stars you find your mind returning, as it often does at this particular hour, to the arithmetic none of the day's noise ever quite manages to drown out completely. Word reached the ship weeks ago, passed hand to hand through the loose network of taverns and small ports that carries news faster among pirates than any official channel manages, that the governor newly installed at Nassau has brought with him an offer signed in the king's own name. Any pirate who comes in and surrenders by a fixed date will be pardoned outright, free to walk away from this entire life with no further charge hanging over him. A good number of men in these waters have already taken that offer, and more will likely follow before the deadline passes, weighing the small remaining hope of one more good year against the arithmetic that every man aboard the Kestrel already knows by heart. Historians estimate the average working career of a pirate in these waters at somewhere around 2 years before it ends by the rope, by a naval broadside, by disease, or, for the fortunate minority, by a pardon taken in time and never regretted. The skipper has not raised the question of the pardon with the crew yet, though you suspect, from certain quiet conversations you have half overheard between him and Corbyn, that the matter will come to a vote before too many more weeks pass. You think about the Bristol brig you left 8 months ago, about wages that came late or not at all, about a captain who never once asked your opinion of anything, and you think standing here with a full share of Today's prize weighing your pocket, and the memory of 80 raised hands settling this morning's chase still fresh in your mind, that you are not entirely sure yet which way you would vote. Somewhere below, the glass turns the half-hour sand glass one more time and strikes the bell, the same small ceaseless sound that has measured out every hour of this entire long day, careless of chases won or storms survived, or men punished or pardoned, indifferent in the particular way that only something purely mechanical can be indifferent to the enormous human weight everyone aboard has hung on the hours it counts. The eastern sky begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to lighten along its lowest edge the same slow bruise purple shading toward orange that greeted you at the start of this day, and you realize with a small, strange jolt that an entire cycle has closed itself around you without your quite noticing it happen. The black flag, struck since last evening, stirs faintly at the masthead in the first breath of the coming dawn's breeze, not raised, only lifted, waiting, the way it waits every single morning of this life, for whatever the new day's horizon happens to bring across it. The sandglass turns again in the boy's small hands, and the sound it makes striking the bell is the same sound it made 20 hours ago when this day began, though nothing else is quite the same man who heard it then. The black flag stirs at the masthead, not raised for a chase now, only lifted by the same wind that will carry the kestrel toward whatever sail crosses her path tomorrow. Most of the men who lived by this code did not live it long. 2 years, historians estimate, was the average run of a pirate's career in these waters, ended by the rope at Nassau or Charleston or Cape Coast Castle, by a navy broadside, or by a pardon signed and kept. You knew the arithmetic when you made your mark on the articles, and you make it again every dawn, and it has not yet changed your mind. Somewhere below, the fiddle from last night's watch still leans against the mast step where it was set down, and the tide is already turning under the hull, patient, indifferent, carrying the kestrel toward the next horizon, whether anyone aboard her is ready for it or not.